Hello everybody, we are in front of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, Museum, and Birthplace. Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States of America, and he served from 1969 to 1974. And we're going to take a look at this museum and see what it has to offer. So come along for the adventure, it's going to be interesting.
Vice President Gerald Ford, who would become the 38th President of the United States at noon today, and his wife Betty Ford, the guard of honor, escorting Mr. Nixon and Mrs. Nixon down the red carpet. As he leaves the White House the last time as President of the United States.
There were all the crowd out there on the lawn, as there have been so many cases before. Kind of raised my hand. I don't know whether it was a salute or a wave, but that was it. Turned, went in and sat down. Heard the engines whir up. I closed my eyes.
Sad moment for the Nixon family, an emotional moment.
I heard Mrs. Nixon speaking to no one in particular. She said, "It's so sad. It's so sad."
And so, Richard M. Nixon, 37th President of the United States, has left the White House for the last time as President and going to California.
Richard Nixon left the White House on August 9, 1974, under very extraordinary measures. He was the first U.S. president to ever have resigned from office, and when he did, he eventually came back to Yorba, California. Nixon did many things as the leader of the free world. He traveled the world and even sent the first humans to the moon. But in an ironic twist of fate, Nixon was buried only 60 feet away from where he was born. So who was Richard Nixon and where did he come from? The Richard Nixon Library and Museum helps tell that story. I think to understand Nixon, you need to understand Yorba, California back in 1913. The Nixon family came from very humble beginnings. He was born in a very tiny room on the first floor of a house his father built. Nixon said, "We were poor, but the glory of it is that we didn't know it." The house was humble, but his father was very handy. The house had a bathroom and an indoor kitchen, which for a lemon farmer was a big deal.
This picture over here, because that's what it looks like in the bedroom upstairs. But also
The docents at the house joked that this was the first Nixon library.
Is the original wedding certificate for Frank and Hannah when they were married in 1908.
Unfortunately, although his father was handy, he was not lucky. The lemon farm did not go as well as the family had hoped to, and they had to sell their house. Richard Nixon always insisted that he was never a quitter, and despite his humble upbringing, was determined to prove himself. He first tried to become an FBI agent, but later became a lawyer and practiced law in Southern California by day and did drama at night. It was while he was in a theatrical performance he met his wife, Pat Ryan. He described it as love at first sight, and the two were married at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California. Needing a more steady income, Richard Nixon joined the Navy in 1942. This was during World War II, and he eventually made it to the rank of commander. Also while in the Navy, he ran for office and eventually became a U.S. representative and then a senator. He would go on to be a vice president of the United States and run for governor of California, but he lost his bid for governor. Everyone thought that when Nixon ran and lost for the race for California governor, Nixon was done with politics, but things were changing. It was the 1960s, and as the song said, there was a change blowing in the wind. In 1962, the United States was led to the brink of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1963, President Kennedy was shot. The United States had over 500,000 soldiers in the Vietnam War. The government said everything was under control in Vietnam, but the Vietnam Army launched a massive counterattack that was to be known as the Tet Offense in 1968. In 1968, there was also race riots that eventually led to the assassination of Martin Luther King. Women also had gone to the streets demanding equal rights. President Johnson tried to calm the masses, but there was million-man marches on Washington, D.C. that simply overwhelmed the government. Nixon saw an opportunity and opposed the Vietnam War. Using the title of peacemaker, his followers declared Nixon as the one and brought him into office. Nixon only edged out his competition in the popular vote by only 1%. But with the Democratic Party divided, he easily won the Electoral College. The Oval Office was now Nixon's, and he had a full agenda. Rather than using the Resolute desk, Nixon decided to use the Wilson desk, which is kind of a misnomer because nobody named Wilson ever used this desk. The desk at the museum is a replica. The real desk was used for a time by the Vice President, but now has been replaced by a desk made of wood by the USS Constitution. Nixon's strength was his power to negotiate. His first act in office was to end the Vietnam War. Nixon tells the story of a safe that was installed right outside of the Oval Office. This safe contained the secret morning summary of the Vietnam War, including the previous day and the total casualty numbers. According to Nixon, he opened the safe once, looked at all the deaths, closed the safe, and never opened it again. The original document was still in the safe when Nixon left office. The end to the Vietnam War was not an easy one. A truce was negotiated, but it did not hold. In the end, the United States left the Vietnam War in a very shaky position. The good thing about the end of the Vietnam War was the release of the POWs that happened in 1972 and 1973. Here in this exhibit, you can see some of the items that POWs would have had in their camps. This is a portrait of Colonel William Nolde, who was the last casualty of the Vietnam War. He died just hours after the treaty was passed. This, however, did not deter Nixon. During his time in office, Nixon did many things. He oversaw the first lunar orbit and lunar landing. He opened up trade with China by being the first president to visit Beijing. One of the interesting stories was told by Pat Nixon, who said that at all the meetings there was a pack of Panda cigarettes. And so she mentioned, looking at the container, saying, "Oh, aren't they cute?" And Mao Zedong overheard her and said, "Well, we'll just have to get you one of those." And that is the story of how the United States got its first Panda. He was the first president to visit Moscow and sign the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks known as SALT, which resulted in limited nuclear weapons. He created the Environmental Protection Agency known as the EPA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA, signed Title IX for equality in women's sports, and expanded the National Park Service by twice its size. His programs were widely successful, and in 1971 he won the election with the largest landslide in American history. Everything seemed like it was going to be another 4 great years for Nixon. Where there is much to be gained, there's also much to be lost. And for Nixon, that came on June 17, 1972, when 5 men were caught breaking into the Watergate Hotel, which at the time was the re-election headquarters for the Democratic Party. The break-in itself did not condemn the president, but later when it was revealed that the president had a secret taping system and that tapes from that system had been erased, it was more than enough to force the president to resign. Having appointed 4 of the Supreme Court justices at the time, Nixon thought that he was above the law, but all the judges voted against him. He knew resignation was the only thing to spare him from impeachment. They say that time heals all wounds, and strangely enough, it did for Nixon. Leaving the White House, Nixon had 2 decades as a private citizen. He retreated to his house called Casa Pacifica, but he eventually longed for the opportunity to make change again, and he moved to New York City in 1979, becoming an advisor to several presidents, including President Clinton, which was from the Democratic Party. In the end, Nixon chose to go back to the place where he started, which was Yorba. We are here in the gravesite of Patricia Ryan Nixon and President Richard Nixon. Simple graves And they elected to be buried here in Richard Nixon's birthplace. In the end, Nixon chose to go back to the place where he started, which was Yorba. The museum wasn't at first part of the official presidential library system, but in 2007 it became part of the presidential library system, and in 2011 reopened with new exhibits that more clearly showed the Nixon presidency. Today, the Nixon Library and Museum is an impressive place to visit and learn more about the life of Richard Nixon. If you have a chance, I encourage you to experience it for yourself. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will see you on our next travel adventure.